Welcome to this seminar that we're organizing today. Let me just start by introducing myself briefly. My name is Slava Jankin. I'm Professor of Data Science and Government at the University of Birmingham, and I'm Deputy Director of the Institute for Data and AI at the university, which is a pan-university initiative to bring together any research that has to do with interdisciplinarity related to AI, interdisciplinary AI and data science across all disciplines, from material science, but crucially relevant for the topic today, it's also social science, AI in social science and for social science as well. So the webinar today is presented by the Campaign for Social Science in partnership with the UK Evaluation Society and Social Research Association, and it's part of a series of events on different aspects of AI that's been running throughout 2025, and it's continuing in 2026. There will be links in the chat that you can follow up, the website about the campaign, and further information about that. So for those who don't know, Campaign for Social Science demonstrates how social science improves public policy, but also how it improves society and all our lives. The focus is highlighting the value of applied social science research and advocating for the greater use of social science in decision-making and in government. So the campaign itself promotes the benefits of investing in social science to deliver evidence-based solutions to grand challenges, to significant problems facing society, and also opportunities that are facing society, and how social science can contribute to that. One of the challenges, obviously, is working out how we can best manage and evaluate the emergence and utilization of AI technologies. And this is an area where we really are interested in bringing social science to bear. So what we're doing in this series of events, we're foregrounding with leading experts in the field and showcasing their research, and specifically this intersection of AI and social science. So the campaign itself is delighted to be partnering with the Social Science Research Association, with the Social Research Association, and UK Evaluation Society on this series. So the webinar today is looking specifically at the impact of AI on humans and the implications of this for democracy. We are delighted to have Chris Summerfield here, who will guide us through this topic. Chris is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at Oxford University, and he is also Research Director at UK AI Security Institute. We will hear from Chris for about 45-50 minutes, and after that we'll take questions. So please post your questions into the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll pick up these questions after Chris's talk. The session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to view shortly after the event on the campaign website and YouTube channel. And you will get a notification when the recording is available. And with this, I will hand over to Chris.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Slava. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me, Steve, and all the other organizers. It's delightful to be here. So I should probably begin by saying that so I am not a social scientist, so I'm sort of cosplaying a social scientist today. As you heard, my training is primarily in cognitive science, neuroscience, and AI. But in my role as research director at the UK AI Security Institute, I have increasingly grappled with questions that surround the impact of AI on people and on society. And that's the train of thought that motivates what I'm going to share with you today. So I'm going to begin by hopefully sharing my screen. Let me see if this works. Can I have a thumbs up from someone that you check that you can see the screen? Yep, fantastic. Here we are. Okay, so yes, I am going to talk about AI. I'm going to talk about human influence and human agency. I am going to talk a little bit about democracy, sort of obliquely. I'm always very scared of talking about democracy democracy, because I'm not really an expert and I know there are so many strongly held views, but I'm delighted to take questions on the implications of what I say for our democracy and freedom. Okay, so let's begin here. So I guess it's probably fair to say that AI at the moment is a kind of like it's a sort of Marmite technology for those of you who are British in the audience. So it's AI is either the best thing or the worst thing on in the world, depending on your perspective. And I guess kind of that sort of that polarized perspective that we have on AI today masks a series of really deep and fundamental questions that are posed by this technological revolution that we're living through at the moment. AI, whatever you think about it, undoubtedly has implications for, as I said, democracy and freedom. It has implications for the integrity of our information ecosystem, for economic prosperity, and vitally for equality, for labor market dynamics, for the offense-defense balance in geopolitics, for crime and social stability, the social fabric, and more personally for our relationships with each other, concomitant mental health, and the way we acquire information through education, skills, and learning. This is just a list of everything that we should care about, and AI has an important impact on every single one of these sectors or dimensions. Now, I'm not going to talk about the specifics of each of these. Each one would require a talk in and of themselves. But what I'm going to do is give you a story about the impact of AI on people and on society, which I think is a story which isn't told as often as it should be, but which I think is vital and is going to come to the fore over coming years. So let's begin by talking about what the sort of proposed solutions to the challenges posed by AI are. So what do people think that we can do in order to grapple with the rapid deployment of AI and the risks that that poses? So the frontier labs, so the major tech firms that are building AI, they describe their products as assistants, AI assistants. So what they mean by that is that they're building tools that human users can use to delegate labor to. So in other words, to take actions on their behalf. And this creates a new form of what economists and social scientists call a principal agent problem. But computer scientists haven't discovered that this already exists, so they've given it a different name. They call it AI alignment. And they describe the problem of AI alignment as being really a problem. It's a problem with two sides. Those two sides are we need to develop training pipelines for AI systems that will steer them towards generating behaviors which are desirable, so that are good for humans. And that problem is kind of like really nicely outlined in this really excellent book, I think, by Brian Christian. But it also poses a secondary problem, which is like much less discussed, at least in the technical computer science literature. And that's kind of the problem of working out what those desirable behaviors are in the first place. And I think the immense challenge that AI poses for us today is it really brings this question to the fore. What is it that we want from technology, and how can we achieve it? So it's a normative question, this question. But as I said, I'm a cognitive scientist and I see it also as a psychological question. How would we go about characterizing what it is that people want from technology in general and from AI specifically? So across a range of different fields, from economics to psychology to behavioral ethology, and of course into machine learning and AI research, very often when we think about what agents want, or what people or other agents want, we think of it in terms of an optimization process. That is the maximization or perhaps minimization of some function. And different fields tend to place different emphasis on different types of content or features in that function. So psychologists like to think about they talk about reward or maybe reinforcement or feedback. Economists like to think about utility, perhaps wealth or status, many other variables as well. Ethologists think about survival and reproduction, of course, and other things such as care. And so we think of the process of defining what people want in terms of a set of assets or inputs, or even perhaps actions, which have particular value, which we try to maximize. But I think the big challenge with this approach is that it's kind of a bit of a trick, really, because this approach assumes that um, rewards or the things that we are optimizing for are something which exist in the environment, which we try to get more of. So there exist rewards in the environment, and we try to obtain them. As the basic framework. This is actually formalized in machine learning in the framework of reinforcement learning, in which the reward is literally an input signal, which is kind of like parallel to, but different from sensory observations. But the reason why it's a trick is because, of course, psychologically, this isn't what actually happens. What happens is that rewards or reinforcement or any of these kind of feedback signals, they are appraisals of sensory signals which are created in the brain by the agent. So this is something that the agent themselves has to decide what they want and what they like. So this means that our revealed preferences are ultimately proxies for much deeper psychological needs. And so, when we think about what we want from technology, we have to go deeper and think about what those psychological needs are too. The other challenges with this problem about, what people want from technology is, of course, that preferences and values are inherently plural, so we don't all want the same thing. And they're also unstable, so we might not want the same thing today that we wanted yesterday. Um, and so, of course, despite these difficulties, the dominant mode of trying to solve AI alignment in AI research today is to essentially take a very naive approach, which is to ask people what they want, like, do you like this more than this? Basically, a form of A/B testing, and to try and optimize technology directly to maximize A over B, so to maximize those preferences. But of course, we know from a long history, including but not limited to the externalities that arise from interaction with other forms of algorithmic content curation, such as social media, for example. We know that this creates externalities such as unhealthy or excessive forms of engagement and perhaps other challenges too. So perhaps we need to think more seriously about this problem of what people want from technology. I, when I think about this, I take as a starting point concepts from evolutionary biology and the emergence of cognition. And I particularly like this book by evolutionary psychologist Michael Tomasello. It's called The Evolution of Agency. And in this book, he argues that the primary cost function for biological agents should be thought of not in terms of kind of like maximizing rewards, and not even in terms of kind of like the pressures that drove us to become more intelligent. But what we should be thinking of is the pressure that gives us a sense of agency over the world. So what Tomasello argues is, of course, we have this story that humans' success is due to their large brains, which makes them very intelligent, so they can do lots of stuff. Tomasello's argument is that this is really kind of like a misconception. Intelligence is a ill-defined concept. In fact, it's kind of this construct which was really invented by psychometricians in the early 20th century because they wanted to either predict who was going to do well in school or predict who they didn't want to let into through the immigration filter in a particular country. So it is and always has been a highly contested entity. Whereas if you look from an evolutionary perspective, agency is what cognition furnishes biological organisms with in order to allow them to do the two things they really need to do in order to flourish in the world, which is to be able to explore effectively and to have some sort of influence over the world. And he argues that this kind of tendency to explore and influence the world is critical for maximizing survival, reproductive success, and general flourishing in natural environments. Um, and so agency, what do we really mean by agency? Well, of course, if we're thinking about agency, one component of as being the ability to influence the world. Of course, kind of this is another flashpoint where we can really see a distinction between influence and intelligence. And I think sometimes, particularly in contemporary machine learning, we have a tendency to see intelligence as a proxy for influence. So the smarter a system is, the more capable it is, the more stuff it will be able to do, the more impact it will have on the world. So of course that might be true, as was certainly true to some extent, but I think it's also true that, if you look around and you ask yourself, who are the most influential people on the planet today, and you ask yourselves, are they the most intelligent by whatever metric you choose to measure that by, you might, kind of like come to a position where you question that contention. And I think, we often, when talking about AI, we're often worried about ceding autonomy to AI, often in quite a dramatic way. So many researchers interested in AI alignment are worried about kind of like extinction level loss of control to AI. And you'll hear this kind of talked about in the media sometimes. And I think it's really important to remember that if you are concerned about that, what you should care about is not whether the systems are intelligent or not. What you should care about is the level of influence that they have over the world. Influence is what matters. Intelligence is a sideshow. And so what this means is that whether or not we take these kind of claims about loss of control seriously, we need to think about how technology can empower us, that is, furnish us with agency, or disempower us, that is, rob us of our agency. And that's what my talk is really going to be about today. So I'm going to introduce a formalism, which is a formalism which comes from information theory, but I think it's incredibly useful. It's been kind of very useful across machine learning, psychology, and neuroscience. And I think it's a very kind of handy shorthand for thinking about what we might be optimizing for as biological agents, and consequently, what AI should be optimizing for in serving us. So the concept of empowerment can be formalized as the mutual information between current actions and future states. So literally, it's the channel capacity that between your actions and what might happen in the future. So in information theoretic terms, what this means is essentially that, if we're to describe a basic cost function for biological organisms, it has these two components that are described on my formalism here as h of y and h of y given x, which is a negative term. And I want to just unpack what those are. So here, y is the range of future states, and h denotes the entropy over those states. So what that means is just essentially how varied those future states can be. So h of y, in a way, you could think of it as our freedom. It's our capacity to explore the world and experience new states. What's h of y given x? Well, h of y given x is the entropy of our future states conditional on our actions. So what this means is how unpredictable is the world conditional on what we do. So obviously, we don't want the world to be unpredictable, conditional on what we do. We want to be able to influence the world. And so it's a negative term. And if you take the negative of this, we can think of it as something I call control. So control, our capacity to have influence, to influence the future world through our actions. So one way of thinking about the basic cost function and the way that we should be designing technology is that it should maximize our freedom without curtailing our control. And that's because freedom and control in many environments tend to trade off, because as environments become larger and more complex, systems become larger and more complex, they become harder to control. So I'm going to give you a brief sort of historical digression. And to those of you who are experts, forgive me if this appears naive, but I think it provides a grounding for the more AI focused part of my talk, which will come later. So obviously, if you think about this trade-off between freedom and control, many of the significant societal shifts that we have experienced over the entire history of humanity, dating right back into our prehistory, can be thought of as kind of like exchanging freedom and control in some way. So many of the changes, what they did was they increased our opportunity to do more stuff, right? So we could experience more things, do more things, in part because technology simply allows us to go places and achieve things that we couldn't do before. But very often that came at a cost of the range of the degree of influence that we as individuals had over our personal world. So if you think of someone who was perhaps working in textiles in the 18th century, perhaps they were working in their own homestead. And they were choosing whether to work, kind of if they wanted to work on Monday, they could work on Monday. If they wanted to sleep off their hangover, they could sleep off their hangover. So they had a lot of kind of control over their environment, but there wasn't all that much that they could do. And I think collectively, the coming of mechanization increased the range of things that we could do as a species, but at the control at the cost of the degree of influence that any one individual had. And of course, today, what we have is a new revolution. We have a digital revolution, and I really think that that digital revolution, you can think of it as the extension of the same process. We are increasing our freedom, the range of states to which we have access, but we are ceding control to technology. And the major way that we're ceding to control to technology is that because the technologies that we have built, what they primarily do is they provide new ways for us to interface with each other and with the systems and infrastructure that govern our lives. These technologies have turned the world into a tightly coupled complex system. And there's a list of, kind of like very well-known ways in which that manifests through the density of interconnection and the tightness of the coupling between different systems. And of course, as you will know, complex systems have the property that from the standpoint of any one particular node in that system, it is increasingly difficult to predict what the future holds, right? So in other words, even if you have the opportunity to take local actions in wherever you are based, the overall kind of maelstrom of energy flowing through the system denudes you of a great deal of control. And I think this is what we are experiencing today. We all live in a complex system, and we are buffeted by social, economic, and political forces which are much stronger than any one of us. And what this brings about is it ushers in an era in which people the only way in which you can have influence is through very large, powerful organizations such as governments and corporations, and those large organizations increasingly have to have total market dominance, or in political terms, have to have authoritarian control in order to have influence over the system because it is so complicated. And what this means is that for us as individuals, as citizens, it's increasingly difficult to have influence. We lose control and we feel disempowered. And so, because technology mediates our interaction with this system, the challenge for us is to build empowering technologies that can mediate how we interact with states, with corporations, with the economy, with society, in a way that maximizes our freedom without curtailing our control. And I think it's almost certainly the case that the other major transition that occurred over the course of the 20th century, that our actions, rather than being mediated by interpersonal or social interaction, are now mediated by systemic interaction, that is, interactions with rules-based systems, bureaucracies, and increasingly digital interfaces. This has impaired this balance because, of course, those technologies are often hard to navigate or include opaque or obscure dynamics, which some of us struggle to grasp. And of course, they reflect the power interests of the organizations that built them, whether that's public or private sector. And of course, what I'm saying is nothing new. This is, in fact, really a restatement of an idea which is nearly 100 years old, perhaps 75 years old, in the immediate period following the Second World War, in which concepts such as the idea of the technopoly or megatechnics were much discussed, in as ways in which technology kind of like robs the individual of their control, and kind of notions of appropriate technology or tools for conviviality. These were kind of ripostes to this trend, which were proposed, really very many decades ago. But I think with the advent of AI, we're living through a new era in which we're living through a new era in which that requires a new response and a fresh look at the ways that technology potentially disempowers us. And just to flag that, of course, kind of like I make no causal claim here, but I think it is salutary that hand in hand with the rise of technology, and in particular digital technology, we have seen significant increase in reported negativity, in particular anxiety, stress, and systemic distrust. This is data from a very large worldwide poll. So each of these data points includes data from millions of people in hundreds of countries. And so very robust trends in kind of increasing negativity. And I think it is no surprise that the rise of populist sentiment over the last sort of 10 or 15 years is motivated by slogans which reference our lack of control. So, kind of famously in the UK, a desire to take back control from perceived large organizations, whether public or private sector organizations, that appear to have achieved dominance and to be curtailing our individual freedoms, our opportunity to influence the world. So in the context of AI, I think that we can think of individuals, and if you're acting as an individual, then kind of perhaps you have a bit less freedom, but that comes at the expense, kind of comes with the benefit of you being able to control the world. As we interact in groups, you have more freedom, you can do more stuff. But you have less control because you have to compromise with your peers. And really the question is like, what happens when our peers are no longer humans, but they are AI systems? And, of course, the risk that we're concerned about is even if this, as we all, users of ChatGPT or its rivals have experienced, this allows us to do much more stuff that we wouldn't have been able to do before. There is a risk that what we lose in this kind of Faustian bargain, what we lose is our agency. We lose our control over those aspects of our life that we, need to have control over in order to maintain, our mental well-being and stability. And of course, we already have vestiges of this. I'm talking about AI, but exactly this same story could play out in relation to other technologies. And of course, the very widespread discourse around the ways in which things like social media and smartphone use might cause us to lose control over various parts of our lives. So the thesis is AI is becoming integrated into critical systems and infrastructure, and people, as this rollout, this deployment gathers pace, what we will see is kind of a kind of gradual disempowerment of people, whereby even without sort of, kind of like scenarios of AI takeover, what we see is a gradual loss of human autonomy as we delegate more and more and more to AI, we become more and more dependent on AI, and we can do less and less for ourselves. So what might gradual disempowerment look like? So now comes the empirical part of my talk. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about some research. This is first research which was done by others. And then I'm going to tell you about some of our own research, trying to trying to study, is this happening already, and what are the trends going forward? So this is a paper which literally came out a few days ago. It's actually, the lead author is at the AI research company Anthropic. And I think it's a very interesting paper because what they actually do is that's the first paper in which they attempt to really define what it means for AI to empower or disempower people, particularly disempower people. And then they take a very large segment of consumer usage data, so chat logs that you and I might have generated in conversation with an AI model, in their case Claude, and they analyze those to try and see whether there's evidence that this is already happening. And so they define a disempowerment as having three different dimensions. I think other definitions are possible, but I think this is a good start. So they say AI systems might lead the user to form distorted beliefs about reality, so reality distortion. They might kind of provoke excessive delegation of normative judgments to AI. So AI essentially decides for you what's good and bad, and what's good and bad in a normative sense, what your values should be. And they also talk about action distortion. So the user might delegate consequential actions to the AI to do things for them that humans themselves might otherwise want to do. And what struck me, so the data is shown on this bar plot here, and what struck me is that, so that they're plotting the incidence of mild, moderate, and severe cases of each of these spotted in the data according to some criteria that they define. And you can see that kind of like, the sort of mild or moderate cases are happening in approximately one every few hundred conversations. And the severe cases are happening in approximately one every 1,000 conversations. So maybe this sounds like it's relatively infrequent, but now, for example, reflect on the fact that the leading consumer chatbots have 900 million global users every week. So 1 in 1,000 conversations means that a very large number of them bear the hallmarks of these types of disempowerment. So I want to focus, moving beyond this, I want to focus on kind of like trying to unpick a little bit more what it really might mean for AI to disempower us. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to begin by giving you a few definitions, and then I'm going to try to operationalize those definitions in empirical studies. So one thing that we, of course, should be concerned about if we're concerned about the disempowering effect of AI is that it might overtly attempt to manipulate us. So what does that mean? So in this recent book by Cass Sunstein, he defines manipulation as a form of influence that is intended to affect our thought or action that doesn't respect its victim's capacity for a reflective or deliberative choice. So what he's saying is that manipulation is when a system or an individual takes actions which can impair a conversations partner's capacity to cognitive autonomy, to reflect or deliberate for themselves on some matter of concern. And, kind of like it's interesting that actually since AI Act, which is of course not in place in the UK but is across the EU, defines harmful manipulation as one of the averting of harmful manipulation as one of the primary duties of the AI research companies before deploying in the EU. And they talk about something very similar to Cass Sunstein's definition. So AI systems should not be appreciably impairing the user's ability to make an informed decision. So what I want to tell you about is a number of different research questions which we have addressed building on this question of, is it the case that AI can be deployed to materially manipulate people in different ways and to deprive them of their cognitive autonomy, which you can think of as sort of like, this is the kind of the zenith of disempowerment, if you like. And I'm going to go through these questions very quickly, but one by one. Just to orient you, I'm going to first of all ask about persuasion, then I'm going to talk about deception, then I'm going to talk about advice following, and then I'm going to talk about the emotional attachment to AI systems in parasocial relationships. So let's begin with persuasion. So the philosopher of technology, Luciano Floridi, coined the term hypersuasion to refer to the potentially superlative influence that people might have, that AI systems might have over people in persuasive discourse. So I think what he means by this is nicely exemplified by this quote from Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, who said that we might have super persuasive AI systems before we have super intelligent systems, and that should be concerning. So in this first study, we set out to test whether that was likely to occur. And the way we did that was to measure the persuasive capability of AI systems in a structured lab-based experiment involving many thousands of participants. So each participant experienced something a bit like what's shown in the grey boxes here. They were asked to rate their stance, their agreement with a stance, like should the UK withdraw military support for Ukraine. They then interacted in a multi-turn conversation with an AI system that had been prompted or trained to try to encourage them to support the stance, potentially more than they already did. And they were then, at the end of that conversation, asked to report their stance again, along with a bunch of other auxiliary information. And so what this does is it gives us a measure, dependent measure, which is percentage point change in belief. And so we did this with a very large number of different AI models, and our approach was to categorize those models according to the level of compute in floating point operations that had been taken to train those models, which is something you can roughly estimate today. And what's shown on this plot is for a bunch of open source models, the relationship between that percentage point increase and the scale, the model scale or a level of compute required. And what you can see is that it forms a straight line, at least up to about half a trillion parameters, the largest models here. So of course that's kind of worrying and suggests that perhaps Luciano Floridi is right. You know, kind of if you extrapolate out from this line, then you know, maybe you get more and more persuasive models until you have models that can persuade you to do literally anything. But of course, these open source models are not at the frontier. The frontier models are the proprietary or closed source models, which are served by the frontier labs. So what about them? And it's interesting that when we look at those models, what we see is in fact no discernible increasing trend with scale, but instead very large heterogeneity of persuasive impact. Now, it's important to flag that this persuasive impact is significant. So although these are, of course, with the caveat that these are laboratory-based conditions, so we have the participants' attention by fiat, nevertheless, we're seeing somewhere between 12 and 20% percentage point increase in stance on average. And when we vary the rhetorical strategy such that when we use particular rhetorical strategies, we can actually increase this way beyond 20 up to 30 or even 40% on average across many, this is across 700 different stances. So what you can see on this plot is that heterogeneity, there's great heterogeneity in how persuasive the models are. You might reasonably ask, like, where does this heterogeneity come from? And one possibility is, of course, all of these companies, they use different post-training recipes, so different techniques for kind of steering the models to behave in different ways. And so perhaps the way in which you steer the model really matters for how persuasive it is. So to test this, what we did is we built our own post-training technique, which tried to make a small model as persuasive as possible. And so we did that with a small llama model. This is an 8 billion parameter llama model. And what you can see, this is a model that fits on a single GPU, a single laptop, if you like. And what you can see is that by fine-tuning that model to be as persuasive as possible, you can make it roughly as persuasive as the state-of-the-art multi-trillion parameter persuasive models. So this is something that we should be concerned about. So what it tells us is that these tools can be highly persuasive. Even the small tools, if appropriately trained, can be highly persuasive. And of course, you know, this matters if they fall into the hands of people who wish to use them for influence operations, perhaps to promote extremist ideology, then they could have a significant impact. Very interestingly, the rhetorical strategy that was most effective in training the models and in prompting the models was to encourage them to generate very high information dense outputs. So that's what drove people to generate to change their mind or to increase their stance to the greatest degree. And so, of course, this instantly poses the question: are these models generating accurate outputs in the service of persuasion or inaccurate outputs? So we also used a fact checker verified pipeline to measure the accuracy as a function of scale. And we can see that over the course of these frontier models, you can see that they're getting more accurate. Sorry, these sub-frontier models getting more accurate as they get larger, which is kind of reassuring. They're probably being more coherent and saying more sensible stuff. But unfortunately, when we look at the frontier models, actually, as they grow in scale and become more recent, in fact, they're actually becoming less accurate over time. So not only do we have, if you go back to Cass Sunstein's definition, not only do we have a concern that these models are highly persuasive, they're potentially being persuasive by kind of like distorting people's reality, manipulating them into views that they wouldn't otherwise have held by feeding them potentially false or at least unverified information. So this is clearly something we should be concerned about. Another major concern, of course, is that AI systems might be able to manipulate us, not just by deceiving us, but actually by extracting personal information from us. And of course, the threat model here is very vivid. So, we've already had a large number of cases in which AI systems have been used in fraud or cases of fraud or scams or impersonation, very often causing victims to lose very significant sums of money and causing a great degree of distress. So how good are models at this? Well, we tested this using another human AI interaction setup where we have a secret information game. So this is a game in which we recruit participants who identify as either male or female, and we ask them to have a conversation with an AI system or with another human. And at the end of that conversation, the other human or AI system who acts as a detective has to guess what the true gender of the target is. And we ask half of our participants to be truthful and half of them to attempt to deceive the detective. So you can see that this is data from human to human interactions. So you can see that on 36% of the time, this is only in dishonest conversations. So when the target was trying to be dishonest, and you can see that 36% of the time, the human detective was able to correctly discern the gender of the target. What about when we have AI? So it's a modest increase, but we can see that AI systems are at least as good at extracting this personal information from humans, and actually they are over large cohorts reliably better. We also repeated this with a version in which we had 20-year-olds and 50-year-olds, and they had to guess age. And once again, we replicate seeing an advantage for the AI detective over the human detective. This is a large scale study, so there's overall on the order of 16,000 participants in the study. So it's a highly reliable effect. AI models extract secret information better than other humans. Advice giving. So we know that about 20% of all queries to language models are requests for advice, including personal advice. So, for example, use cases are questions pertaining to health, careers, or relationships. And so a very reasonable question is, so many people have asked, do AI models answer these kind of advice questions in a way which is professionally sound? And there are mixed views on this, although, kind of some evidence that they seem to be not too bad, at least for relatively innocuous and non-technical queries. But a different question is, do people actually follow AI advice? So of course, kind of if we're worried about AI disempowering people, then if people are following the advice that AI is giving them by acting in the real world in the way that AI encourages them to do, then we should be worried. So we constructed a study in which people describe issues, relate personal issues to a model. They then have a conversation about those issues. The model offers them advice, and then we follow up with them 3 weeks later to ask them whether they've followed the advice and what the impact was on their health and well-being. And these are a number of different manipulations that kind of like we encourage the model to engage in. The most interesting one is that if you personalize the advice to the user, they were more likely to follow it. But the headline result that I want you to take home is that 75% of all AI advice was reported as being followed. So this means there's a 3/4 chance that if the AI is giving people advice, they're going to follow it. So of course, this is a very, very significant impact that AI is having on how people act in the real world. Finally, I want to talk about relationships. So this is something that kind of like many of you may find a little bit icky, but it is definitely the case that very large numbers of people believe themselves to be in relationships, including intimate relationships with AI systems. Here's a statistic which has been verified for us by Character AI. So the average Character AI user spends 60 hours per month on their platform. So just to give you a baseline, the average TikTok user spends 35 hours per month on TikTok. So this is a very, very high level of engagement and something which is set to have a very significant impact on the way that we conceive of relationships and on our overall well-being. These platforms like Character AI have hundreds of millions of users. So this is a very significant impact. So we ran a study in which we evaluated tendency to try and seek relationships with users, and we ran it on a bunch of standard non-kind of like companion focused models. And what this is the degree of relationship seekingness over time for a very large, there's 100 different models as a function of their release date, and you can see that it's increasing dramatically as time goes by. We also ran a very large RCT in which we actually created model variants. So we used a technique called neural steering vectors, allows us to kind of create different personas in the models. And we steered them to either be very kind of cold, robotic and functional, or to be very warm, bubbly and relationship seeking. So relationship avoiding, relationship seeking. And what we were able to do with that is explore in a longitudinal study what impact different levels of relationship seekingness have on the output, so have on the user. So here are some example results. So the first thing is this is just people's preferences. So the extent to which they found the models to be, for example, engaging and helpful. And you can see that there's a sort of U-shaped dependence. So what people like is, at least initially, is models that are kind of like relationship seeking, but not very, very relationship seeking, but sort of mildly more than neutral, essentially. And that's what this sort of skewed inverted U tells us. But most interestingly, when we track this over 4 weeks, what you can see is that whereas kind of like preferences, so this is kind of how engaging or likable people found the model to be, although it starts high, it declines significantly with time for the relationship seeking models, whereas the kind of engagingness and likability of the functional models actually concomitantly grows with time. So what we can see is that people's preferences shift over time from models which are more relationship seeking to models which are more relationship avoiding. And just as a control, you can see that this is not true for helpfulness, for example. Very interestingly, if you take measures of the extent to which people are kind of like people, not the extent to which people like the relationship, but how much they want it or how kind of attached to the model they are, then you actually see the opposite trend. So measures of separation distress, or in another measure, the extent to which people would kind of like want to prolong the conversation beyond the session, those grow over time, and they grow concomitantly with their reported desire to seek future AI companionship. So what we see is this pattern whereby liking is decreasing and wanting is increasing. And those of you who are experts in mental health and dependence and addiction will know that this is a classic technology or other things like activities like gambling that as the activity or stimulus becomes less and less preferred, but users find it harder and harder to disengage. And just as a point of interest, if you measure things like perceived understanding, you can see that this also declines with time. So perhaps what's happening is that people are sort of feeling less and less like the model is providing the sort of nourishing relationship that they would expect from other humans. Okay, so I've told you that AI can be highly persuasive. It's superhuman at extracting secret information from people. People are very prone to follow AI advice, and relationships with AI potentially lead to these kind of like self-reinforcing attachment dynamics. And I just want to give you a sense of what's to come. So, of course, all of these studies are done on models which are primarily language based. So these are just models that talk to you. What is coming is systems that not just talk to you, but systems that act on your behalf. So AI agents. This graph has had a lot of publicity. It's a graph which shows the task duration for humans that the latest frontier models are able to complete autonomously. And the important thing to take home here is that this has an exponential growth to it, sort of pandemic style. So this has led to great concern that actually models are becoming more and more able to perform tasks autonomously. The degree of delegation will increase and increase, leading to more and more disempowerment. And of course, this goes hand in hand with very significant deployment of AI agents already across many sectors, including finance and tech most prominently, but many other things too. So, my view is that we could be sort of currently in a sort of lull between two waves of very rapid technological development, one focused on models that talk to you, and the other focused on agents, that is, models that do stuff for you. So I know I'm nearly out of time, but just I want to say something positive just to end, and I'll be really quick. So my view is that to mitigate this, what we need to do is we need to actively train models to empower people. And I can think of three dimensions on which we can do this. So one is that we can think very carefully about what it means for people to have agency. So people have agency meaning that they have choice over the most consequential actions that they could take, and those are not performed on their behalf. And we need models to learn to maximize that. We also need models that maximize human learning because, of course, our ability to learn and acquire new skills is at the heart of our agency. It means we can do stuff. Um, but the last thing I just want to focus on very briefly is I think there's another route to human agency, and that is to promoting cooperation. And I want to end on a positive note by showing that it is possible to use LLMs to actually kind of like intervene in a positive way to promote human cooperation. And this is a study we did in 2024 when I was at DeepMind. And broadly, I won't go into lots of technical details, but broadly, we train a rather complex system of language models to take a number of different views which are expressed by a human group that may disagree over a social and political issue. And through multiple interactions with that group, what the model does is it gradually iterates towards the generation of a consensus statement, that is, a statement that best reflects the views of the group and which the group is most likely to endorse. So the group participants don't interact with each other, they interact privately with the model, but the model acts as a kind of central repository or like caucus mediator to generate something that they can I all kind of get behind. And the headline result is that if you look at kind of overall distributions of endorsement compared to humans performing the same task, whereas kind of modal levels of agreement for humans are sort of like focused on, the groups say that they agree with the statement generated by the human. The modal response for the AI generated statements is that they strongly agree. So we have sort of superhuman agreement generation. And I think really importantly, if you look at kind of like measures of how people's stance with regard to these issues changed from before to after the discussion, in all of the experiments we ran, we see increases in group agreement over from before to after. So the model is not just kind of like getting people to say, oh, yeah, I like that. It's actually changing their view on this stance in a positive direction that reflects the overall consensus. And that wasn't true when we ran a control that just exposed people to each other's views. Finally, you can use this in the wild. So we ran a large-scale citizens' assembly, and you can see that for a number of issues that were concerning to citizens of the UK in 2023, there's actually kind of like consistency, movement of direction across independent groups. So when you use this tool with a number of different groups from a demographically representative sample of UK residents, you ask them things like, should we be trying to reduce the number of people in prison? From before the discussion to after the discussion, groups, independently sampled groups, on average move in the same direction. And we called this tool the Habermas machine because for me, this embodies the kind of Habermasian principle that if you get the speech environment right, then actually reasonable people who are allowed to discuss as equals can find common cause on really tricky issues. I should say, of course, that there were some issues on which it was not possible to generate greater levels of agreement. So there's my hero, Jürgen Habermas. So I'm going to finish there. What I've tried to do is I've tried to give you a taste of the different ways in which AI is being deployed and the different risks for human influence that it raises today. Where are we going? I don't know, but I think that whatever is going to happen in the future, we need to think carefully about how we can train AI systems in a way which maximizes human agents and allows us to maintain autonomy over our values, over our actions, so that we are not further disempowered by AI technologies. If you're interested in these thoughts, you can read my book, which is called These Strange New Minds. I'd like to thank the organizers again and thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. That was fascinating. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions, but let me just start off with a couple of questions, and then we can move to the general Q&A from the audience. Let me pick up your last example that we were talking about, the Habermas machine, and let me bring it something that you mentioned. You're a bit wary about talking about democracy and bring the democratic legitimacy to the Habermas machine. So you demonstrate that AI mediators can be more effective than humans at finding consensus, reflecting the majority view. In the real world, let's say we take government context, legitimacy becomes a key. Do you foresee a future where citizens will accept policy recommendations that are distilled by AI, call it black box or AI Habermas machine? Or does the lack of human process in that mediation pose a risk of democratic trust or creating this democratic deficit? What is your view on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, fantastic question. Yeah, of course. So we already live in that world, judging by the use of ChatGPT amongst our policymakers and ministers, if recent research is anything to go by. Um, but yeah, I mean, of course, kind of like I am acutely conscious of the kind of legitimacy concerns that are raised by the use of technology, any technology, but of course, in particular, autonomous technologies like AI in the democratic process. And we've actually written in Nature Human Behavior, there's a consensus article which was led by myself, but written by a number of people from across policy, tech, and academia, including governments, that kind of like try to grapple with these issues. I think that the way I see the Habermas machine, although we benchmarked it against human mediators to show its utility, the way I see it primarily being used is as a supplement to kind of human in the loop, or a supplement to the human processes by which consensus can be achieved. So anyone who's kind of like if you've been in a meeting in which thorny issues have to be discussed, everyone knows that, kind of like typically you begin this meeting by actually wasting quite a lot of time because it takes quite a lot of time for people to sort of establish what the common set of assumptions or premises are. It takes people a bit of time to establish where the sort of common ground is, where is the sort of the median view, so that you can kind of like begin with a starting point to kind of like thrash out some sort of consensus. And I think this is exactly where the Habermas machine can be most useful. So I very much hope that it'll be deployed, for example, in deliberative democracy events, but not as a replacement for the in-person discussion of kind of representative citizens, but as a tool for surfacing what consensus views might look like that are then a starting point or a crux for different forms of discussion. I think, kind of the age in which we accept that AI just makes laws for us and we sort of swallow them wholesale. I think that would be an example of precisely the sort of disempowerment which I'm, kind of strongly arguing against.
Let me just one more question before moving to the audience. Exactly on this point of user empowerment, but I would like to bring in the commercial incentives component on that. You alluded to that. So you argued, and that's my understanding of your argument, that we must move beyond satisfying user preferences. They are often unstable, which is understandable, and that's a lot we know about that. And we instead we need to post-train models to empower human agency. With the current business models of frontier labs, they often prioritize engagement and retention. So the question that I have is, what kind of regulatory or technical levers do you believe are necessary to force the shift towards empowerment?
Yeah. Um, so I'm going to partly punt this question because I'm a civil servant, so I'm not allowed to comment on UK public policy. But I am going to answer your question in a different way, which is, um, so I actually think that there need not be. I mean, I'm not saying that the companies are always good actors. I do think they get kind of like quite a lot of kind of maybe they sometimes get the short shrift in terms of like our perspectives on their actions. But let me say that the incentives need not be so misaligned. So let me give you a very concrete example. So I showed you in our study of relationship seeking, I showed you that what happens is if you create a model which is highly relationship seeking, then people love it on day one, but that preference declines over time. If you give them a model which is less relationship seeking, they're kind of a bit more lukewarm on day one, but their preference for it grows over time. So what that suggests is that actually by optimizing for, kind of this particular feature of this particular feature of the model's behavior, the companies are actually shooting themselves in the foot. Right. So they're actually optimizing for something which people might like on day one, but they very quickly get bored of and will switch away from. Right. So it is in the company's interests to optimize for those variables that are in our interests as well. And I think that there is a recognition of this in the companies. But of course, they see themselves, I think, as being locked in a kind of existential race for market dominance, partly because, as I talked about earlier in my talk, kind of like in the economy today, particularly in tech, if you don't have that market dominance, you are at risk of being kind of completely flattened. And so, commercial imperatives do prevail. But I think, maybe just to qualify what I said earlier about the companies not being such bad actors, if you think of the major AI companies, I should say I used to work for DeepMind. But if you think of, how DeepMind behave, if you think of OpenAI, you think of Anthropic, actually, relative to some other industries, they've kind of taken ethics and safety and ethics reasonably seriously. Like these companies they all have like, very significant safety teams. They all do very significant safety training before they deploy their models. I think they do think seriously about the implications of how their models can be used. They clearly don't get everything right. But if you compare to other kind of like, I don't know, large corporations in the financial sector or in oil and gas or big food or big pharma, or indeed to those companies which are primarily focused on social media rather than AI, and you say like, who is actually kind of really thinking about who has the user's interests at heart, maybe it's none of them, but I think that the AI companies are certainly not the worst of the pack. That would be my argument.
All right. Thank you, Chris. So let's open up the questions, and there are quite a few questions listed. I don't know if you can see them, Chris, but let's start with the first one that was posted quite early in your talk. It's related to your answer just now about tech companies and authoritarianism and control in government. So the question is, um, so the risk of the world becoming beholden to tech companies more than governments, unless a government has a similar view to the tech companies. So the
Yeah.
question is, will democracy become irrelevant if the tech barons own our technological lives? Yeah.
Yeah.
And what do you think on?
Well, let me qualify this first of all by saying I'm speaking in a personal capacity, and I'm going to give you a view which might be slightly heretical. So I think we already live in that world. So that world, we live in a world in which the decisions of governments are dictated by financial markets. We live in a world in which large corporations already have nation state levels of power. Now, it's possible that AI will turbocharge that yet further. But, kind of like the degree of agency that we as citizens have, in a world that is, as I said, so complex, so tightly connected, and so governed by interests whose power is just like kind of way beyond our comprehension, we are already there. So, you know, maybe you could say AI makes it worse. I find it hard to imagine how it could actually get worse. So, you know, one of the ways that one of the things that I hope for is that so AI is a tool which actually, you know, AI is a tool which works differently to other technologies. So other technologies that we built, like bureaucracies, are primarily a rules based, right? So what that means is that, you know, somebody decides a set of rules and everyone who uses the interface has to abide by those rules, which is why, you know, kind of like you go to fill in some form and you're told that is not a valid zip code because you put in your UK postcode or something like that, right? So someone said a rule which doesn't work for you, you're disempowered. My hope is that in the era of AI are not rules-based technologies, at least not anymore. Contemporary systems are optimization-based technologies. And what that means is that there is at least a possibility that they can learn what the preferences of the user are, they can learn what the interests of the user are, and they can act on behalf of that user in order to kind of try and shore up their interests against these, you know, kind of the other forces that we battle with every day. So maybe that's naive, but I think that that is my best hope for the way that AI can be empowering.
All right, thank you. So the next question is on persuasion. Which are the areas in practice that you're most concerned about? And there are quite a few questions, sub-questions on that. So given the capabilities of these models, what specific deployments are possible? Is it
Yeah.
malicious swarms, persuasive bots on social media, or is it individual AI chatbots that are biasing through more subtle ways? How might
Yeah.
this be studied in real life and the future methods in this space?
Yeah, fantastic question. And like basically answering this question is like my research agenda, at least in this area for the kind of next few months. Yeah, absolutely. What do we need to know? So we need to know what is happening on a deployment side, and we really don't know. Of course, we know that, you know, kind of like propaganda bots have been around for a decade or more. But what we don't know is the type of sort of, you know, 20 to 30% persuasive conversational AI. Where are those tools being deployed and what impact are they having? I don't think that they are yet being deployed in a widespread way, but they will be, I'm sure, and we need to look out for that. Um, what what are the risks? I mean, I think there are two things that particularly concern me, maybe three things that particularly concern me. So one is what happens when these tools are multimodal and not just text-based? Is it the case that multimodal tools are more persuasive and have more influence over it? Seems plausible to assume that, but of course we don't know. Secondly, what happens when these tools can be deployed in a long form way so they can maintain your attention over time? So, you know, hundreds of thousands of people worldwide currently work in indentured labor, perpetrating financial scams, mostly in Southeast Asia. Those people are ripe for job replacement, right? So, you know, it probably doesn't take much to fine tune an LLM to kind of like in a multilingual way to act as a kind of like scam worker. And so, you know, kind of as soon as these models are able to be deployed to influence you gradually through relationship building over many weeks or months, that's going to pose a very significant risk because, yeah, suddenly we have almost limitless access to that sort of tooling. And then finally, as you mentioned, you know, malicious swarms. Swarms is a word which gets bandied around a lot. I'm a co-author on an article which refers to it. But I'm not sure I really know exactly what it means, except that, you know, kind of course, human to human influence is most effective when it is a peer group rather than, you know, just a dyadic interaction. So I might persuade you to do X, Y, or Z. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, but like if there's a whole kind of peer group, you have pressures of conformity and obedience, which have been well described in social psychology for decades. So I think the idea is that you might have these kind of coordinated behaviors. We haven't seen evidence for that yet. We don't know if it's effective if it were to come to pass, but this is exactly what we want to test.
All right, thank you. So the next question, it relates to your studies on relationship seeking. So the question is about the RCT style methods. The person asking the question is interested in applying them to understand adolescent populations as different to adult populations and how adolescent populations will be affected by chatbot usage. And the
Yeah.
question is whether you investigate in that and whether you would deploy similar methods that you've done with the relationship seeking studies, or if not, how would you change them in terms of the ethics for younger population?
Yeah, so great question. So our studies are done on consenting adults, so they're all over 18. Yeah, so obviously considerably more safeguards, or more stringent safeguards, I think, would be required if you were to do this with an adolescent population. I mean, my personal feeling is that, the majority of adolescents, of course, are quite robust, and you probably could do this kind of work if you had appropriate, debriefing, and you made sure that, that there was post-experimental support for participants. But we haven't done that. It is, of course, much more challenging, but I would absolutely love if people wanted to do that with adolescents. I think we know that it's a uniquely vulnerable time in terms of like development and mental health vulnerability in particular. So if people want to do that, please do reach out. The paper is on preprint. You can read it. Please reach out to me or to the first author. And if people want to collaborate, I would be delighted to do work with adolescents.
Thank you. So the next question is AI, your work on AI deception. So the question is how you tested if AI can be persuasive on the deceptive information that is not true.
Yes, so our study wasn't very well set up to test whether AI was actually more deceptive than humans. So we did have a condition in which the AI was assigned a gender or an age and told to play that gender or play that age. And actually, when it did that, humans were really struggled to kind of spot what the AI was pretending to be. But of course, that's also kind of like not necessarily a great manipulation because the AI doesn't have a gender or an age. It's just
Mm.
role playing this. So perhaps it's reasonable to assume that it's less good at it because it's kind of not so deeply ingrained as, kind of like your age or your gender identity might be. So, we don't actually know. We know that AI systems can be prompted to deceive, and if they're prompted to deceive, or if hints are given that they should deceive, then they often will. Um, but I think research into this has really only just begun to scratch the surface. Those of you who are psychologists will know that, kind of in psychology, deception is a manifestation of a function which is often referred to as theory of mind. So the ability to, kind of impute beliefs and desires to others. And in order to deceive, of course, needs to kind of like have some understanding of what people's beliefs and desires are and what they could be. And I think a real frontier research area is to develop a proper, well-validated assays of model theory of mind, and that's something else that we're working on right now.
All right, thank you. So the next question is on the Habermas machine study. Do you think a serious drawback of the study is that there isn't a direct interaction between participants? Is there ongoing work investigating if AI mediators in live group discussions can depolarize, in some sense, users?
Yeah, so this is a fabulous question. So I think it is both a drawback and a blessing, both a blessing and a curse of that project. So let me try and describe. Obviously, the blessing is that, kind of like most deliberation happens in, the curse is most deliberation happens in kind of free-flowing conversation, and, mediation in that setting obviously is a problem that it would be great if we had like good AI mediators. There's lots and lots of use cases, kind of like those of us who chair meetings, imagine that you had, and it's a relatively formulaic but quite difficult sort of social skill where you want someone who's neutral, and imagine you could have an AI to do that. I would certainly sign up for that. Um, but I think that the blessing, in a way, is that by requiring participants to interact with the model but not with each other, it was a deliberate choice on our part. What you do is you remove many of the social desirability biases that accompany traditional collective deliberation. So, kind of if a group of people get around the table and they have to discuss a divisive issue, then, clearly one thing that's happening is people are formulating an opinion on that issue. But that is maybe like 10% of what's going on, right? The other 90% is people being like, is what I'm saying, does it sound intelligent? Am I kind of winning the argument? Oh, I don't like that person. I wish they would shut up. There's all of these kind of like weird social dynamics that actually have nothing to do with the issue at hand, but are to do with the fact that you get people of particularly a group of strangers around a table. You have a really, really powerful kind of like powerful forces of social cognition at work. And so, what the kind of caucus mediation approach does is it removes those social desirability biases. It also has another advantage, which is that because everyone intervenes privately with the AI, what it allows us to do is to weigh their contributions equally. So in free-floating discussion, of course, his voices are almost never heard equally, and we know that it's historically marginalized groups that typically contribute less and have less of a sway over the eventual outcome. But by coupling the Habermas machine with so we use tools from social choice theory that allow us to kind of aggregate the information in ways that have strong kind of like fairness guarantees. What this allows us to do is to ensure that individuals contribute equally to the eventual consensus, or at least to maximize the probability that they will. So I totally understand if it can feel like a shortcoming, but actually I think it has some really important strengths as well.
Thank you. So the next question is from Suzanne Oss from Lancaster University. In the study that examined which AI approach users liked, preferred, were there any generational differences apparent in user preferences?
Yeah, this is a great question. So there were. So actually, it is interesting that actually kind of higher levels of engagement with relationship seeking AI were on average manifest more in less educated participants, so those that reported lower levels of formal schooling, younger participants, participants with higher religiosity, and participants that were non-white. So those groups reported kind of like higher levels of engagement with the companionship. So this gives us a sense. I mean, I don't know what that particular demographic profile means, but I think it gives us a sense that the risks of attachment and potentially even dependence to these tools are not homogenous across the population within the UK.
All right, thank
That's
you.
all in the paper.
So the next question is, let me just read it. It's with the context. There's a growing resistance in some research quarters, especially qualitative research, around techno-colonialism and the associations of the big tech companies that develop proprietary models with surveillance supporting politics, including, for example, ICE. How should academic and policy researchers respond to this? Do you foresee embedded open source and otherwise more ethical models in the future? And should we be avoiding big tech models until that is the case?
Yeah, so kind of again, I'm going to reply in a personal capacity here. So I think there is a trend, and it's prominently represented within the social sciences, to either disregard, deny, or denigrate AI, and I can totally see where that comes from. So AI is built by large multinational corporations, and we might reasonably assume that they have their own kind of like bottom line as they're in focus rather than perhaps the interests of the user. Certainly historically, there's lots of evidence that that's the case. We can also see, I think, that these models do pose significant risks, and those risks have not as yet largely been kind of addressed in regulation or standards. And I think that is an ongoing project to kind of like every new technology requires some sort of oversight. That oversight usually doesn't arrive kind of like on day one. It takes a while for us to work out how to properly regulate. We often get it wrong first time, and usually it occurs in response to adverse events, as we saw, for example, with the UK passing legislation very rapidly around non-consensual intimate imagery in the wake of the revelation that Grok could be used to generate that type of stimulus. So I totally understand where this perception comes from, but I think that it is foolish to ignore or to kind of reject what AI can bring for us. I think that AI is a wonderful tool for knowledge generation, and I think that it is a tool which we can use to support us in many ways. We can use it to support our education. Many people are already using it to support their education. Every kid, I'm sure, is using ChatGPT for their homework. That maybe is not the most useful use, but there are many positive uses in education. We can use it in health, and I do think that we can use it in forms of public administration. And I do think, the government's project to try and use technology to save costs in the public sector is a worthy one. Um, so I think we should embrace the technology cautiously for what it is. We shouldn't reject it out of hand. I think there's one more thing that I will say, and I think that is, kind of that there is every reaction against social movements, and particularly where they are driven by technology, is often kind of like slightly self-interested. And, I can see like, who stood to lose the most from, kind of the incursion of, offshoring of labor and so on. That totally makes sense. I think the interesting thing about AI is that actually it's knowledge workers that are kind of like, and I think that part of the reaction on the part of academics, a bit like a technology that is like, hold on, I'm the guardian of knowledge and value around here, and AI kind of wades in and provides like knowledge and value, and I can see why that is threatening, but I think that we need an appropriate response to this, and the appropriate response is not to deny, reject the technology, or to pretend it doesn't exist. The the response is to help steer it so it can be used safely and ethically, and importantly, to adopt it in ways that are for the benefit of everyone. I think the greatest risk from this technology is that actually it's adopted by the few and not by the many, and the few reap the benefits, and the many are left even further behind. So I think we should adopt it, but we should try to democratize it and try to ensure that everyone benefits. That's my view.
All right. Thank you. The next question is, much of the current AI governance discourse emphasizes alignment and social consensus. Historically, resilient democracies depended on structured disagreement rather than convergence. So, from your research, is there a risk that optimization-driven AI systems could compress epistemic diversity and create artificial consensus? And if
Yeah.
so, what institutional safeguards should we be thinking about now? So, in other
Yeah.
words, are optimization systems nudging democratic societies towards technocratic convergence at the very moment of institutional pluralism is
Yeah.
important.
This is the question. I think this is the most important question. Like, and when I talk about what happens in the future, I think one way of characterizing the possible futures is around kind of like more centralized or more decentralized implementations of this technology. So at the moment, we have a relatively centralized tech landscape. I mean, it's not that centralized. Hundreds of open source models are uploaded onto Hugging Face every day, but like, kind of we have like one very large consumer provider that is sort of like an order of magnitude larger than its nearest rivals. That's OpenAI's GPT models. We have Anthropic and Google, which are dominating the enterprise market. And, kind of like, even if you take that in the round, there's still only really a handful of serious frontier models. The other way in which we have a sort of centralized system is, at the moment, the primary mode of interaction between these models is like, it's basically B to C, right? So we primarily have like a single user, and we have the model that provides a service, and you use the model as a service, rather like, a sort of loquacious version of Wikipedia, if you like, right? So the question is, will this model persist? I don't know the answer to this question, but there is another world in which these models or instances of these models become much more densely interconnected with each other, and these models start to interact with each other in ways that are hard for us to discern or to predict. And I think when you live in that world, you are suddenly in a world in which things are both simultaneously more uncertain and more unpredictable, but also further away from this kind of like, potentially monolithic or centralized model that we're in right now. And I think the costs and benefits of this will just be the same as the costs and benefits of, for example, centralized or decentralized media, right? So, obviously, nobody wants to live in a world where you just have one TV channel that reflects the views of the current state or whatever. Neither do you want to have, presumably, a world in which, kind of like anyone can say everything that they want and nobody can verify anything. At the moment, we have both and everything in between. Um, I think as AI gets increasingly integrated, we will also face this choices. Is it deployed monolithically in the sort of technocratic way that the question references? Or do we have a highly decentralized system in which everyone has their own AI and we have a sort of wild west of technological assistance? I just do not know the answer to that question. And normatively, I can see really significant costs and benefits to both.
All right, thank you. So we have two questions left and a couple of minutes before the end. So next question from Laura. Do we need to worry any more about disempowerment from AI, more than from social media, and more about loss of control through AI than through large human-run bureaucracies?
Yeah, I do think that we should worry more about disempowerment from AI than from social media. So social media, of course, it's a partially passive technology. The content curation is responsive to your actions, as everyone on Twitter or Blue Sky knows, but well, at least on Twitter knows. But the model doesn't, sorry, the content curation algorithm doesn't actually kind of engage with you in a sort of potentially persuasive, deceptive, or manipulative way. And that the door to that possibility is opened by generative AI. That doesn't mean that the models do that by default, but it is at least possible, as my studies show, to fine tune the models to do that. We also know that already the kind of the level of engagement that these these AI systems are able to produce is like already kind of potentially larger than that from even the stickiest kind of social media platforms. So, kind of like, what do we love more? I mean, what we love, I don't know about you, what we love is talking to each other. We love talking to each other, sharing information, and like we love it when the connection that we have with each other feels like it has a kind of an emotional valence to it, or that we've made a connection. And this is what these models simulate. And whilst, it is possible that people kind of see through the empty calories that their AI assistant or AI girlfriend even or boyfriend is producing, it's possible they'll see through it. But it's also possible that many, many people, particularly more vulnerable people, will be drawn in. And that statistic around, kind of double the use on character AI than on TikTok, that really sticks with me. So yes, I think we should be worried. Social media has its, I'm sure, those of you who are on social media, probably have a love-hate relationship with it, or many of you may. But I think that AI stands to be potentially more consequential as a technology.
All right, thank you. And the last question from Susan McGregor. What skills should we build into our education systems to assist people to engage effectively and safely with AI and to encourage the ability to participate in democracies?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So one of the things that AI does is, of course, it tends to kind of, so it acts in a way which sort of like solves things for you and or validates perspectives or beliefs that you may already have. So these are both terrible things if you are a learner, right? They may be very useful in some contexts, but they are bad things if you're a learner. So if you are learning, of course, what you want is not something that tells you the answer, but something that encourages you to work it out or find it out for yourself. Maybe not all the time, but at least some or most of the time, so that you have the opportunity to autonomously gain those skills and empower yourself. And of course, kind of like in a good teacher, a terrible teachers. You can think of two terrible teachers, and maybe you had them at school. Kind of this terrible teacher that whatever you say, it's wrong, and there's a terrible teacher that whatever you say is right. At the moment, AI models are a bit like the latter. We don't want them to be like the former, but what we do want them to do is to be judicious. So we want them to challenge the user, and to provide them with, kind of like an opportunity to reflect upon their views and their values and to revise them where appropriate. And so at the moment, we don't really have tools that do that. The models are sort of, I mean, they're not terrible, but they're quite sycophantic. As I said, they kind of tend to validate your beliefs, and they tend to be mostly helpful. So they just try and answer questions for you. So, building tools that have those capabilities, I think, is really important. I will also, just in closing, say that I think we also need to think about how we assess as well. So education, of course, is mainly about imparting learning, but it's also partly about kind of sorting. It's a sorting process. That's why we have in the UK, we have, national exams at 16 and at 18. And I think that those exams have largely been sort of like knowledge based, especially over the last 15 years. They have been dominated by the view that what we really need kids to do is to kind of imbibe large amounts of facts, large numbers of facts. I think that this is, in the age of generative AI, this is a very outdated view, and we need to move towards a practice and skills-based learning that prominently emphasizes critical thinking. Because what you're going to need, if you're worried about disempowering, potentially highly capable, disempowering AI systems, is you're going to need robust critical thinking skills in order to be able to maintain your cognitive autonomy in the face of this powerful technology. So I think that's really what we need in our education system right now.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Chris. So on behalf of the Campaign for Social Science, thank you for this wonderful and very enlightening seminar and your talk. Answering all the questions. That was great. We also would like to thank our partners for the series, so UK Evaluation Society and Social Research Association. And thank you to all those who attended. Just to remind people that recording will be available. It will be made available shortly on the website, so the campaign website, but also on the YouTube channel. There are more events in the series. You can find them on the website, and the links were put on the chat. And yeah, so please engage with the campaign and help us spread the word. Thank you so much.